welcome to my channel on the Best of Fantasy 2023 is just about at its close, and so like booktubers everywhere, I thought I might tell you about my favorite reads of the year. Beginning with my few rules that I have set for myself, one being I do not include rereads, so even though I read a bunch of Ursula Le Guin this year and loved the experience, I'm not including those 4 books at all because I did reread them. Next year, there might be some Le Guin on my list, though, because I'm going to be continuing with the Ursula books, finishing them up, and those books will be new to me. Those will not be rereads, so I'm excited for that. Another rule I have set for myself is that 1 book per author will be included. So even if there are certain authors like Robin Hobb, for example, where there were multiple books that could have easily made this list, I'm only going to include 1 so that I can include more authors. And finally, I do not have a set number. This is not a top 10, or it won't be ranked or anything like that. And I just like to include, as in the past, the books that moved me the most. The books that spoke to me, that gave me a change in perspective, that brought me on an emotional journeys, all those kinds of things, and that made me think. So those are my basic rules. And with that, let us get right into it. I'd like to start with the books that I read for SPFBO, the Self-Published Fantasy Blog-Off. The contest started by Mark Lawrence in order to shed light on self-published fantasy, and there are some great self-published fantasy books out there. I know because as a judge for the contest, I got to read a bunch of them. The standouts for me were Mithril Feywood's A Gamble of Gods. This is fantasy blended with sci-fi, with some very memorable characters, a bit of romance sprinkled in there as well. And I just had an enormously great time meeting these people. The characters became important to me, and the relationships between them were compelling and interesting as they got further and further into their adventures. Another standout for me from the 30 books that I was judging for the contest in the first phase was Bob the Wizard by M.V. Prindle. This also coincidentally is a fantasy sci-fi blend, but this features a very gruff character, central protagonist in Bob the Wizard, a character that I came to love and found to be a very compelling and interesting personality. And I enjoyed seeing the layers to this character gradually unfold as I got further and further into the book. And the humor in there was fantastic. Just some great interactions, a bit of a brutal read at times, but very compelling. I enjoyed it immensely. And of course, the book that I picked among the 30 to be my finalist, and that is Murder at Spindle Manor by Morgan Stang. This is a steampunk type fantasy with major Agatha Christie style mystery at its heart, and it has some really brilliant character work, some wonderful thematic inclusion, as like themes of alienation and how to live in a essentially hostile or indifferent world. It's very atmospheric, very effectively written, with some wonderful humor as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's not a very long read either. It just went, I read it in a couple settings and loved it, loved the experience. So those are the standouts from SPFBO. I also want to include another self-published book. This was not part of SPFBO 9, but it is a book that I enjoyed thoroughly, and it is a self-published book. It is A Drowned Kingdom by P.L. Stewart. This is the first book in the Drowned Kingdom saga, which is projected to be a 7-book series, with book 4 coming out in 2024. This is epic fantasy at its heart. It is very much inspired by the classical epics, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and for me, I saw real wonderful echoes of the Aeneid especially. I love the kind of atmosphere that P.L. Stewart established in A Drowned Kingdom, with his central character particularly being a very interesting character, because I expected, based on what I had heard, to not particularly like this central character. And indeed, there were many moments when I disliked him intensely, and yet P.L. Stewart had me rooting for him at times and understanding him, and because of the culture that he came from, I think that's a really important aspect of this book. Without saying too much, obviously I'm avoiding spoilers here, but that is a very important part, thematically speaking, with what P.L. Stewart is doing, and I very much look forward to seeing where he takes this epic series. And another standout for me among the manga that I read this year, easily my favorite is Vagabond. I I just had a very moving time reading this series throughout, and it is incomplete, and yet I felt so satisfied at the end of Vagabond, particularly because of the exhibit that the mangaka Takehiko Inoue put together as a kind of a stand-in ending, if you will. It was very moving and beautiful. The art was just tremendous. It's a very emotional experience. But the series as a whole included themes that are very interesting to me, and I would say beyond interesting, I think very important. There's the idea of connection between individuals, the idea of where to put one's passion in life, where to find meaning, how to connect with other people. So many really great things. And also violence. There's a lot of violence in that series, but the entire series, far from just glorifying the violence, is, I think, continuously questioning it. And the results of that violence that is something that Takehiko Inoue delves into quite effectively, I would say. Another great read this year was Ian C. Esselmont's Forge of the High Mage. This is the fourth book in the Paths to Ascendancy series. This is a Malazan series. Esselmont followed up his novels of the Malazan Empire with his prequel, Paths to Ascendant, prequel to novels of the Malazan Empire, and also prequel to Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen. I just love Malazan. I have declared many a time that it is my favorite series of all time, and I do include both Esselmont's and Erickson's work when I say that. And so it was just wonderful to be back in this world, to be encountering some familiar faces at an earlier stage of their career, and to get some insights into characters that I thought I knew. And that's a very Malazan thing, if you're not familiar with the series, is you're always getting a different perspective on a person that you thought you knew, that you might have even judged, and then you realize maybe you were a bit hasty in that judgment. Besides that, there's some wonderful Malazan themes about questioning history, what we think we know, and the dangers of certainty. There's a lot in there, again, about connection, a beautiful Malazan theme, and compassion. And it just is so wonderful to have that Malazan humor yet again, because I think that's something that Erickson and Esselmont share that I really enjoy about the series, is the Malazan humor. Another book series, speaking of Malazan, one that I feel deserves to be spoken of in the same breath as Malazan, as I would say Realm of the Elderlings, as being the most complex and rich and rewarding and vast and deep series you can find in the fantasy genre. It's Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wurts, which I have been reading this year. I'm 4 books in. It's a little difficult for me to say which is my favorite at this point, but I'm going to go with Warhost of Vastmark, which is, you might think that's not what I'm holding up here, but this is it says Ships of Merior on the cover, and in this hardback form, the hardcover form, Ships of Merior includes Warhost of Vastmark, which Janny Wurts actually thinks of as one story. So if you like, Ships of Merior is my favorite, if we're going by that. But in most places, it's an 11-book series, and Warhost of Vastmark is the 4th book, rather than the 10-book series you would get if you're getting all the hardcovers. Whichever you want to call it, Ships of Merior or Warhost of Vastmark, I really enjoyed it. It's the end of the second arc in the Wars of Light and Shadow, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I am so excited to read more and more in this world. I love being in Athera. The prose is so rich and I think rewarding. It does take a little more effort to, I think, get into Janny Wurts' prose, but once you're there, it has a classic, timeless vibe to it that I think is conducive to some great fantasy storytelling. and I'm enjoying myself immensely in this world. This is probably going to go up there as one of my favorite series of all time. Let us see. And speaking of favorites, well, I said this that this is unranked when I started, and I'll stick to that for the most part. But if you forced me to say which of these books is my number one, my favorite read of 2023, and a couple people have forced me to do that for those compilation collaborative videos. I'm looking at you, Matt, and Johan. I would have to go with Mark Lawrence's The Book That Wouldn't Burn, and I'm holding up an ARC here. It does say The Book That Wouldn't Burn on the spine, but on the cover it says All Books Fall to Dust, which is important, thematically speaking, to this series as it is so far. It is the first book in the library trilogy, The Book That Wouldn't Burn, and it is such a different read. It is the only book where I can honestly say at the end of it, I immediately felt like starting over, like rereading the book, because there are things that Mark Lawrence does throughout the book and even at the end that made me think, what have you done here? And that is brilliant. And it changed what I thought about I had read earlier. And so I love that. It's like a giant puzzle piece with the pieces falling into place very gradually. And I feel like I'm getting a glimpse of what the picture might be. I have enough pieces in place now. But let's see what happens, what Mark Lawrence does with book 2, which is coming out. My most anticipated read of 2024 is definitely going to be book 2 in the library trilogy, which is The Book That Broke the World. I am very excited for that, to see what he does. But the themes that he weaves in here, so timely. The idea of knowledge and where it comes from and how reliable or unreliable it is. What we think we know may not actually be the truth. The unreliability of history, identity and memory, and where identity comes from, otherizing and finding oneself in the other. And some beautiful characters in here too. I loved the character journeys. Even the side characters were so vivid and interesting to me. I loved every moment in The Book That Wouldn't Burn, and I'm so excited to see what Mark Lawrence does next. Well, speaking of brilliant authors, I had, as I alluded to earlier, I have to include something by Robin Hobb. And this was a difficult one because I loved pretty much everything, even the Rain Wilds Chronicles, which is, like many other people who are fans of Realm of the Elderlings, I can safely say that the Rain Wilds Chronicles, that would be my least favorite series within Realm of the Elderlings, but I really enjoyed my time there. But I also just loved Tawny Man, which I read this year, and I am loving Fitz and the Fool so far. I have already one book down in Fitz of the Fool, and I am soon going to be reading book 2. So I thought about it for quite some time, and it really came down to 2 of those books that I read this year. One being the final book in the Tawny Man trilogy, which is Fool's Fate. And the other candidate is the first book in the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. And it came down to just a sliver with me saying, declaring Fool's Assassin, book 1 of the Fitz and the Fool trilogy is on my list of favorites for the year. I just could have put Robin Hobb all over this if I only had, if I discarded the one book per author rule. But I think Fool's Assassin does edge out Fool's Fate for me, for 2 little reasons. One, the Fool's Fate, though it was incredibly moving and the payoff was tremendous, it has that famous Robin Hobb slow burn beginning, and in most cases it's a couple hundred pages of that. In the case of Fool's Fate, it was, I would say, more like 300 pages. It is one of the longer ones, and it just took a little while, and I was a little bit impatient there when I was reading Fool's Fate. And the other reason that tips the scale slightly toward Fool's Assassin in a positive light is that this incorporates a theme that is very moving for me, and that is a parental theme. I don't want to get too into details here because I want to avoid spoilers, but there are parental themes in Fool's Assassin that I expect to continue in the next couple books, and they just hit me. They hit me right in my heart. And I was so moved by this book. I'm not surprised by that because Robin Hobb is, I think, one of the writers who appeals to my heart the most. and also does some great thematic work too, by the way. Just some incredible stuff in here. So this is an author who always gets me emotionally, but also gets me intellectually, and I think she's just the perfect package. And I can't wait to finish Realm of the Elderlings. It is going to be, if I ever do have the courage to make one of those top 10 videos, I've already included Robin Hobb as my number 3. And Malazan, I said before, is my number 1, Tolkien being my number 2. I don't know. I don't know what would happen. I have to finish Fitz and the Fool, but let's see. But I really did love this start to that final trilogy in Realm of the Elderlings. And speaking of intellectually satisfying, here we have Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. And this is a book. I'm counting it as one book because that's how Gene Wolfe thought of it, as one book, even though it's divided into 4. If I did have to say which of the 4 parts I would put forward, probably Citadel of the Otark Part 4 as my favorite part, at least the part where I could make the most sense out of what was going on. But I did find this to be intellectually very interesting and satisfying in many, well, maybe satisfying is not quite the right word, but fulfilling in that it was a challenging read, and I love that. Gene Wolfe gave me a lot of challenges in here. I love the themes he's got in here around language and where meaning comes from and how that relates to language and how our language shapes our view of the world around us. I love the stuff he has in here about identity and memory and so many other cool things. There's a profound meaning in this series. I'm not always sure when if I'm understanding it correctly. It is a pretty trippy read in many ways. Emotionally speaking, I don't think I was nearly as engaged as I tend to be in many of my other favorite reads, but intellectually very engaging, very interesting. Another puzzle of a book in many ways that kept me guessing. And I think it'll be something that I'll want to continue reading Earth, the New Sun, and the other books that Gene Wolfe has written in this world to see if I can make more or less sense of what he's doing there. And I'll probably reread Book of the New Sun at some point as well. And hopefully feel like I have a little more idea what I'm doing during the reread. And, well, here's something that is actually, I don't know if I'm cheating or not, but anyway, here's Beowulf. It's technically, I mean, you could say a reread because I have read Beowulf many a time. I do prefer to read it in Old English. But there's this brand new, wonderful translation out this year. It is by the venerable Tom Shippey, and it is also edited by Leonard Nydorf, an accomplished medievalist in his own right. But if you don't know who Tom Shippey is, he is one of the most revered medievalists around today. He's also an extremely respected Tolkien scholar. And I had the amazing privilege, this is kind of a bucket list thing for me, really, the amazing privilege of talking to Tom Shippey about this translation of Beowulf on my channel this year. It was a bit of like a me meeting one of my heroes moment. It was wonderful. I mean, Tom Shippey is somebody whose work I cited in my PhD dissertation. I have always regarded him as one of the most accomplished scholars in medieval studies. So it was really just awesome to be able to talk to him and get his take on Beowulf, and also to delve into some of the choices he made as a translator. He's a very thoughtful translator, and I think that if you want to get as close as possible to the meaning of the original poem in Old English without actually learning Old English, then Shippey's translation is the way to go. And I intend to teach his translation going forward. Well, another read that I'm so glad I did this year is the Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft. And I'm putting Book 4, The Fall of Babel, as one of my favorite reads of the year because I found it so compelling and challenging, and also in a way that, that I know that a lot of people are aware that this fourth book is very divisive, that some people are just like scratching their heads at the end of at the end of this. But I love that Bancroft just went for it in this series. And to me, he was setting up these themes from book 1 and knew exactly what he was doing. And where he went makes a lot of sense from that perspective. If you're looking at it in terms of him developing, delving into these themes, it's an absolutely brilliant, genius finish to this bizarre, different book series. I mean, it is steampunk, but it's different from anything I think that I've ever read before in many respects. It is at some points, it's not allegorical, but it feels almost allegorical in moments. I mean, Babel is in the title here, so the Tower of Babel is a very central symbol, but also a physical place in this series. And I just loved what he did around that. There's a lot of social critique in here, and there's also some very personal and beautiful and very real feeling in the midst of this bizarre world. The human relationships in here feel very real. There are some moments of melancholy and understanding oneself. And, that process of understanding oneself, it's not always pretty. It's not always going to be triumphant. There are going to be moments when understanding oneself means learning a bit of humility. And that I found so compelling. And also just those relationships were so beautifully done. There were some very touching moments that you could say were not maybe as emotionally fulfilling as you would find in many stories, but felt real. And for that reason, felt compelling. So I really enjoyed the ending to that series. My final selection for my favorite reads of the year. This is one that I had to wait on until the last minute because I was just finishing up Jade Legacy. This is book 3 of the Greenbone Saga, but it is actually not. It is not my favorite. This was a tough one, folks, because I've enjoyed this immensely. So don't get me wrong, I love this book, but I'm going to say that Jade War, book 2 of the Greenbone Saga, is my favorite of the 3. I enjoyed all 3. The reason I'm not holding up Jade War right now, and I'm holding up the blue one instead, Jade Legacy, is my daughter stole my book from me, and I don't have it at the moment. So I have this here as it's holding the spot for Jade War, but I also did love this book. There's so many really iconic moments in Jade Legacy, but there is for me, a kind of a structural critique of Jade Legacy that affected my enjoyment just a bit. I still love, if I weren't selecting Jade War, I would certainly be selecting Jade Legacy. So again, don't get me wrong, I loved the book, but I felt like Jade War was just a bit more coherent as a whole. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. I'm going to do a dedicated non-spoiler review of the Greenbone Saga, and I'll get into that a little bit, but I'll be mostly just singing its praises. I loved the trilogy as a whole. Some amazing themes in there, themes that are very relevant to our world. There's a lot about identity, both personal and national. There's a lot about globalization and how it affects one's personal and national identity. There's a lot about family. There's a lot about friendship. There's a lot about power and what it does to people and what it can do for people. So there's just a lot of great themes that are very subtly woven into this tale. And at the same time, some great emotional moments. So this was a great series. I am so glad that for me, it lived up to the hype. A lot of my dear friends on BookTube really love this trilogy, and now I can count myself among them. So that's it for me, guys. I would love to hear about your favorite reads of 2023. Tell me what you think about the ones that I picked, if you like. And see if you can sell me on something that you found to be a wonderful read that you came across during this wonderful year of reading. I wish you all the very best, and I hope that 2024 will bring you many new, amazing reading experiences. That's it for me for now. Until next time.